Yes.
Deborah King is the moderator, and we'll get started. Thank you so much.
Yes, good morning all, and welcome to this first panel of the conference this year. The title, "The Past is Not Past," gave me pause. I think so this first panel of the conference this year. The title, "The Past is Not Past," gave me pause. I think so much when we think particularly of the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade, that New England, until fairly recently, has been seen as disconnected from that history. But here in New England, the past is not past. The ships that traverse the Atlantic, bringing cargo and humans between 4 continents for profit, were built on the land and from the trees that grew on the lands of the Penobscot, the Mohegan, the Wabanaki, the Penobscot, and the Narragansett people. Here in New England, we have not forgotten, right, that the past is not past, that those who were seeking to liberate themselves and evading, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, the slave catchers were assisted as they traveled along the unmarked railroad to what the sons and daughters of Africa who lived here in New England lamented sometimes as being the deep north. No, the past is not past. When we see the textile mills, those quaint sites of tourisms, of artist studios, of offices and condos that once wove the cotton into cloth. Here in New England, the past is not past, and we will not forget. We will not forget that the present is a reflection of the past. The displacement from homes and nations of origins, the convergence of the COVID pandemic and police violence, the struggles over legislation surrounding divisive language and voter suppression bills. No, we shall not forget. This first panel is intended to help us to appreciate and understand how generations of those of African descent and their allies struggle to find ways of not mere survival, but of thriving in these lands. Let me briefly introduce our panelists, again referring you to the longer biographies that are posted on the website. Chief Wándé Abímbọ is a scholar of the Yoruba language and literature. He is taught at the universities of Ibadan, Ife, and Lagos. As you already know and have experienced, he is not only an ambassador of Yoruba language and culture, but he is a practitioner who invites us all to understand the power of the oral tradition of Ifa and how it conveys an epistemology, a philosophy, a set of ethics and aesthetics of the Yoruba people. Reverend Robert H. Thompson, an elder in the AME Church, has shared his wisdom from the Christian Gospels, from the pulpit and in song, as a consultant for spiritual and ethical education, through community service and institution building with racial unity, and the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, and in joining other faith leaders in addressing national concerns of immigration, sexism, and bigotry. He is engaged in what in a statement was described as the public test of Christian truth and discipleship. And then lastly, our third panel, Dr. Christopher Cameron began his training and his interest in history in the state of New Hampshire at King State. So he is a son of New Hampshire, we will claim him. And his sojourn into history has begun from his undergraduate thesis to his two books, To Plead Our Cause and Black Free Thinkers, to his current project on liberal religion and race. He has relied on the poems, the essays, and the narratives of African Americans to demonstrate not only their creativity, but to demonstrate their philosophical exploration of issues of reason, ethics, freedom, and citizenship from the 18th century to the present. He is also, as the founder of the African American Intellectual History Society, been involved in encouraging not only rigorous scholarship, but sharing that scholarship with the public through social media and one of my favorite websites that I use in my classroom, Black Perspectives. We will go in the order of that's listed in the program of the panelists. And so Chief Wándé Abímbọ, please begin.
My topic is the faith of our ancestors. The faith of our ancestors. What is it that sustained our ancestors on the African continent in those long years of the Atlantic slave trade, or before then, in those long years of the Middle Eastern Indian Ocean slave trade, through trials and tribulations on the Middle Passage, in the slave markets of the Americas, in the plantations for more than 250 years. That is what I want to talk about. Our ancestors, before they came to the Americas, or were taken to all other parts of the world in the Middle East, and up till now, believe in one high God. In the Yoruba religion, that ancestor is known as Olódùmarè. Olódùmarè. It is not true what the Western European anthropologists have popularized around the world, or what the Christian and Islamic evangelists have popularized around the world, that African peoples, indigenous peoples of Africa before slavery, did not have belief in one God. The only difference, as far as Yoruba is concerned, is that we believe that our high God lives in heaven above, and there is another place inside the crust of the earth where he also lives. It's what I call the belief in two heavens. But it's the same high God. And he's assisted by many divinities who are intermediaries. Like you know, in the Christian Bible or the Islamic Quran, there's one high God, but there are intermediaries. The intermediaries are called Orisha. And they are both male and female. A lot of them came down from heaven above to the earth where we all live. And in addition to those who came from above, there are those who are forces of this earth. In our own belief system, mountains are divinities, rivers are divinities, lakes are divinities, some animals are divinities, some trees are divinities, and all this work together with Olódùmarè. And the person who is in charge of this belief system is Eshu, who is a figure who traverses heaven and earth. He goes to heaven every day to tell Olódùmarè what is going on earth. And when he goes to heaven, either heaven above or heaven below, wherever Olódùmarè is at that time, he travels by wind. If you are sitting in front of your house on a hot summer day and a gentle breeze comes along, and you say, oh, thank God for this breeze, that is Eshu going to heaven, maybe heaven above or heaven below. And another divinity who travels like that by wind is Ifa, and I will return to that later. So our ancestors worship nature. And I can tell you that this is what we all, as human beings on this earth, what we all need to understand. Unless and until human beings raise nature to a pedestal that is almost equal to the same position of divinities, so that we don't have to treat the ocean or animals like whales in a bad way. We don't have to treat rivers in a bad way. We don't have to deal with trees as if they don't matter and as if they are made for our enjoyment. Our world will continue to be a shrinking world until probably the violence that we have done to nature comes around and consumes all of us. Nature is our mother. We are a part and parcel of nature as humans. Nature is not there for us to enjoy, just to enjoy it. Do whatever you like with it. Cut down any tree, do any violence to any animal, bulldoze mountains. This is what has caused the environmental degradation that we are all going through today. Our own religion believes that we are a part and parcel of nature. Take, for example, Kábíyèsí Ṣàngó. When we call his name, we lift up our body from our seats. Kábíyèsí Ṣàngó is thunder, lightning, and rain. His wife, Ọya, is the hurricane and the tornado. All the forces of this earth, both the gentle ones and the violent ones, are what our people worship. And how do we worship them? It's through what we call ẹbọ. First of all, through divination. Ifá tells us when we divine what to give to each of these forces of the universe. And then we give what you have, because nothing goes for nothing in the African universe. You have to put down something so that everybody will know that you are serious, you know what you are doing, and you are committed. This is what Christian evangelists and Islamic evangelists have asked us not to do. That, oh, you can't do sacrifice. It's wrong. What is wrong about it? It is a way for you to show the divinities that you are serious. Now let me talk about Ifá for 1 minute. Ifá is the divinity of wisdom and intellectual development. And it's a belief system of West Africa. Ifá is believed to have bequeathed to us a system of literature and divination, which is so vast. It is believed that there are 256 chapters to this book of Ifá. And each book has 800 stories. When you go to a diviner, he would use his instruments of divination to divine for you and hit on one book out of those 256. And it is from the contents of that book that will advise you. First of all, he will tell you what your problem is and advise you what sacrifice or ebo you have to put down so that your problem can be resolved. This literature of Ifa is so important as a contribution of peoples of African descent to the world. And people are just beginning to recognize its importance. Imagine if we are able to transcribe, record and transcribe, probably even translate some of these verses, 800 in each book, and there are 256 books. All the books in the literature of Ifa are 256 multiplied by 800. A lot of it is still with us, even though so many of these stories went away with our ancestors, not only those who are enslaved and taken out of the African continent, but even those who were converted to Islam and Christianity, which is still raging on the African continent today.
Excuse me, Chief Abímbọ. Bola, we need to move to the next person so that we don't get too far behind. And I really hate to interrupt you, but I also want to be respectful of our other panelists and also to have time for those who are attending to be able to ask questions in response to the wisdom that you've shared with us.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. So Reverend Thompson, would you please present, please?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate Chief Abímbọ's introduction, and it really sets me up very nicely. So we have Africans who have found themselves dragged across the ocean, landed in an unfamiliar land without independence, without the ability to worship, without permission to worship the divinities they know and love in the ways that they've grown accustomed. And the world that they entered is one that was unknown to them. I appreciate Chief Abímbọ's language because it really sets up very nicely this world. The question that I'm asking is, what was it that enabled them to survive? What sustained them? And how were they able to make sense of it? To me, the answer, and really the record is that whatever else happened, their use of music and the value of spirituals as expressions of their independence and of their faith really were unparalleled in terms of granting strength and direction. Some of the songs they sang spoke of their pain and gave them a way to address the horrors of what they were experiencing, spoke of their loss, and it spoke of their hope. For instance, the spiritual wade in the water, which probably echoes the experience of those trying to escape. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. And so you see that man all dressed in red. God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, it looks like the band that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. So they began to borrow from the imagery, the new ideas, the personalities that they were exposed to through this new religion, this Christianity, that the slave owners allowed them to celebrate and to use, believing it was a means of control. These Africans, however, were not stupid. They were not haters of freedom. They understood how to live a life that allowed them to celebrate the divine and yet still remain alive. So they sang these songs. They sang them sometimes secretly. They sang out their pain. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home. A long way from home. In my mind, it's late at night. They're having their prayer meeting done in secret. They've put a kettle in front of the door and pointed the kettle towards the woods, the land beyond the farmed land, so that the sound would travel in that direction, away from the big house, so that they could indeed enjoy and celebrate God in a way that meant something to them, that meant deliverance. And so they sang their songs of pain. They told the stories of their new world. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. So they're in these cabins, having their clandestine worship services, celebrating God, singing their pain, singing their hope. Mysteriously, in my mind, these songs move from plantation to plantation. And I imagine there were verses that were sung. We've lost those verses. But these songs were meaningful, and they were strength providing. And they provided a link to the worlds that were lost. Sure, there were drums that went with them. But the intonation, the musical structures echo Africa. The scales they used, everything about the music drew from what they had experienced at home and created something new and spoke their pain. How do they survive? They survived because their faith was indomitable, because their belief in God was not easily vanquished, because in spite of everything, they had hope. How could they have had hope? How could they have had hope? Several generations in, there was no one living who had any memory of freedom or actual memory of Africa. And yet they sang these songs of deliverance and promise and hope in a language that was new. And they were shrewdly deceptive, and they were powerfully real. Powerfully real in the sense that what they spoke, what they sang, the God to whom they sang, these all were real, powerful, living entities. And they were connected to those entities, the people, the land, that one high God, whether they were Yoruba or Ashanti or where they came from, they were all profoundly religious. And they found a way to celebrate the divine themselves together in this new land. And the fact that I'm here speaking to you is proof of the validity and the strength of their faith. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now to Dr. Cameron, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Helena and Gina, Jerry Ann, and Mike for organizing this wonderful conference. I presented at the conference in UNH, I think in 2009 or 2010, so it's an honor to be back here now and be able to share some of my new work with you all. Title of my paper is African Americans and Religious Liberalism in Colonial and Revolutionary New England. In his 1743 book, Seasonable Thoughts on the State of Religion in New England, Charles Chauncey, minister of Boston's First Congregational Church, proffered a harsh assessment of the revivals that had been widespread throughout the region for the preceding 4 years. Chauncey took umbrage with ministers such as Jonathan Edwards' emphasis of the importance of emotions in religious practice. And additionally, Chauncey railed against the rise of African-American exhorters that became increasingly common during the Great Awakening. Another thing that very much tends, as I apprehend, to do hurt to the interest of religion, he wrote, is the rise of so many exhorters. There are among these exhorters babes in age as well as understanding. They are chiefly indeed young persons, or rather boys, nay women and girls, yea Negroes have taken upon themselves the business of preachers. By lumping African Americans with women, children, and the uneducated population of New England, Chauncey, one of the first preachers of religious liberalism in colonial America, helped support Blacks' subordinate position in the region's social strata by noting they were among a group uniquely unqualified to preach the gospel. On the one hand, Chauncey's articulation of Blacks' place within New England's religious life is emblematic of many African Americans' experiences with liberal religion for the next 150 or so years. Chauncey summarily dismissed the notion that African Americans could be religious leaders or make substantial contributions to New England's religious life. At the same time that he disparaged Blacks' mental fitness to preach, however, Chauncey welcomed African Americans into his congregation as members. In the early years of Chauncey's ministry at Boston's First Congregational Church, 1730 to 1749, 15 Blacks were baptized out of the total of 738 people. This represented a small percentage of Black people in Boston, yet others likely attended services on a weekly basis. During the same period, 8 Blacks were baptized in Jonathan Mayhew's West Church in Boston, and 8 more were baptized in Ebenezer Gay's First Parish Congregational Church in Hingham, Massachusetts, 3 of the first churches with liberal religious ministers. Among these latter 8 Blacks in Gay's church were Frances, a mulatto woman, and Jack, a Negro, the latter of whom also became a full member of the congregation. Receiving the sacrament of baptism and attending one of these 3 congregations would have made those Black parishioners among the first African Americans to be exposed to American religious liberalism. Blacks' place within Chauncey's congregation speaks to the complex yet important ties between race and liberal religion from the latter's inception. Religious liberalism emerged partly in opposition to the democratizing tendencies in American religious life that made Christianity increasingly appealing to slaves and free Blacks alike. Despite this fact, African Americans were still drawn to liberal religious churches and liberal theology over the course of the 18th century. For one, Charles Chauncey's message that salvation was open to all rather than only available to the elect, as the Calvinists preach, was an egalitarian one that appealed to Black parishioners. Rather than condemning Blacks to damnation because of their skin color and supposed descent from Ham, Chauncey's theology posited that individuals could take charge of their spiritual fate and attain salvation through moral behavior in this life. Those Black parishioners who were baptized would have done just that and aimed to exercise some control over their fate after death. Additionally, Black parishioners were attracted to these liberal and more conservative Protestant churches for more practical reasons. As the historian Jared Hardesty points out, enslaved Africans were able to use what they learned in Boston's churches, including the ability to read and write and a powerful Christian vocabulary, in order to meet the master class and other whites on their own terms and challenge the boundaries of slavery. Even though slaves in Boston who may have been forced to attend Chauncey or Gay's or Mayhew's churches would have gained knowledge of Christian ideas and rituals that they could use to both integrate themselves into colonial society and resist the institution of slavery. Literacy helped to create networks for slaves, allowed them to obtain better employment, gave them the ability to shape their own lives, with some even gaining their freedom. Such was the case with an enslaved woman named Rose in Chauncey's first Congregational church. Rose was enslaved to Nathaniel Byfield and had been in the province since 1718. She was baptized and admitted to membership in the first Congregational church on July 27, 1729. Two of her children were also baptized that same year. When Nathaniel Byfield died in 1733, he freed Rose in his will, largely because of her religiosity, writing that Rose hath with great pains and diligence learned to read and attained to considerable knowledge of religion, concerning whom I am persuaded to believe that she truly fears God. This fear of God on Rose's part pushed Byfield to set her free from the servitude she stands obliged to me by both purchase and custom. Byfield was certainly under no obligation to free Rose when she converted to Christianity, but decided to do so anyway. This example may very well have influenced other Blacks in the area to become baptized in Chauncey's church. As the colonial period came to an end, a religious movement known as Universalism began to gain steam in England and the United States. Universalism posited that God's loving nature would not lead him to damn anyone to hell for all eternity, but instead that all people would eventually be saved, hence the term universal salvation. Some posited something akin to Catholic notions of purgatory, whereby sinners would be published in an afterlife but eventually redeemed, while some argued that sinners suffer here on earth and would go right to heaven at death. Both Jonathan Mayhew of Boston's West Church and Charles Chauncey were early believers in Universalism, which, along with Unitarianism, would become one of the leading liberal religious sects in early America. Among the founders of the first Universalist congregation in the United States, the Independent Church of Christ, was a former slave named Gloucester Dalton. Like most Black people in colonial and revolutionary Massachusetts, Dalton does not make many appearances in the historical record. He was likely born in Africa around 1723 and may have been the same Gloucester whom John Ellery, a slaveholder from the Cape Ann region of Massachusetts, freed in 1748. Now, the Independent Church of Christ had a liberal theology, just like Chauncey and Ebenezer Gay, and also played an important role in forwarding the separation of church and state in Massachusetts. Gloucester Dalton was likely also attracted to an egalitarianism present within Universalism more broadly. Dalton himself was a respected member of the congregation, even if there were few other Black members. And the congregation was also home to one of America's first authors on the topics of women's rights, Judith Sargent Murray. For Murray, her Universalist theology pushed her toward a more progressive view of gender relations and called for equal educational opportunities for the sexes. While the Universalists did not necessarily encourage gender equality in their churches, Universalist theology nevertheless provided a religious framework that female intellectuals such as Murray could use to defend their belief in gender equality. Gloucester Dalton and his wife Phyllis Freeman likely followed the example of Murray and applied their Universalist theology to issues of race. That is exactly what other Black religious thinkers of the era did, with writers such as Phyllis Wheatley reminding her readers to treat Blacks equally because Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. Gloucester Dalton's influence would extend well beyond his hometown of Gloucester and well into the 19th century. The independence of spirit and courage in forging a path from slavery to freedom and in helping to found a new religious movement in Massachusetts would be emulated by his descendants in the Bay State. One of these descendants was Scipio Dalton, who was very likely Gloucester Dalton's son. Scipio was born enslaved in Gloucester and had been a house slave for some years past in the home of Isaac Smith of Boston, with whom he signed an indenture agreement in 1779. The agreement noted that if Scipio faithfully performed his duties for 2 years, he would gain his freedom in 1781, which did happen. After he gained his freedom, Scipio remained in Boston and became one of the leading Black activists in the city. He was a member of the African Masonic Lodge that Prince Hall formed in 1775, and he helped found the African Baptist Church of Boston in August of 1805. In addition to Scipio's role as what Richard Newman terms a Black founder, Gloucester Dalton's grandson, Thomas Dalton Jr., also played an important role in Boston's Black community. Thomas Dalton Jr. was born in Gloucester in 1794, and by the age of 17, he was already getting involved as an activist. He moved to Boston in 1817, but remained committed to improving the lives of Blacks in Gloucester, as evidenced by his founding of the African Humane Society, an organization that aimed to buy land for an agricultural school for Blacks in the town. Dalton Jr. became involved with multiple Black benevolent societies in Boston in the 1820s, and in 1826, he helped to found the Massachusetts General Colored Association. This was the first formal Black abolitionist organization in Massachusetts, and Thomas Dalton Jr. was its first president. He would go on to become the Grand Master of the African Masonic Lodge in 1831, further marking him as one of the leading figures in Boston's Black community. Dalton Jr. remained an activist and politically engaged citizen for most of the 19th century until his death in 1883, showing the long reach and influence of his pioneering grandfather and religious leader, Gloucester Dalton. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cameron. We want to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to ask their questions, and we so much appreciate the wonderful thoughts that have been shared with us this morning by our three panelists. So we're going to be foregoing the breakout sessions in order that we all might participate and share and benefit from your questions and the answers of our panelists will present. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Let me please encourage others to write your questions there. But this first question is to Reverend Thompson. And the questioner asks, was the African Methodist Episcopal Church the first African American church in the United States? Professor Thompson?
Professor King.
Reverend Thompson.
Professor King, I'm sorry. Bob, Reverend had to get off for a minute. He'll be right back.
Okay.
I can take that question.
Okay, thank you.
So the AME Church was the first sort of Black incorporated church in the United States, but it wasn't the first. So in 1775, 76, a Black church was founded in Savannah, Georgia, right? So that would be the first African-American congregation. That was followed up with Bethel AME Church in 1794 and St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in 1794. Those are both founded within a week of each other in Philadelphia. And then Bethel AME Church would go on to start its own denomination. It would become incorporated in the early 19th century as an individual congregation. And then it would be its own kind of formal church with branches throughout the nation, starting in 1816 with Richard Allen as its first bishop.
Thank you very much for that response. There is one other question I'll ask you, and since you're here with us, the question is posed by a participant who wants information about the lodges and wanted to know where they were formed and was there a religious purpose behind the formation of the Masonic lodges and others.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was a religious purpose for the formation of the lodges, although they eventually came to serve something of a religious function. So really, I think that the impetus behind forming them was just an effort to build up the community in Boston, an effort to provide an outlet for Black leadership and camaraderie, right? It was open to Black men only. So the first lodge was formed in Boston in 1775. Prince Hall got the charter for this lodge from an Irish Mason who was visiting. And of course, we know the sort of antipathy between Ireland and England, right? So for this Irishman, this was sort of like helping out one of the enemies of his enemy, right? So this Irishman helped to charter the lodge in 1775. In Boston, the Prince Hall Lodge became really an activist space, right? So it was founded in 1775, and then Prince Hall, 2 years later, submitted a petition to the Massachusetts General Court calling for an end to slavery. So the lodge helped to support activism. It helped to support educational efforts and efforts at mutual aid. But by the early 1790s, we do start to see something of a religious function for these lodges, right? They have a minister, their own minister, and Prince Hall every couple of years gave charges to the lodge that were heavily infused with sort of Old Testament Christian language, right? So they weren't founded for religious reasons, but they eventually had kind of a religious element to them. And once Prince Hall's lodge was chartered, he was able to then charter other lodges in Providence, in Philadelphia, and in New York City. And those became ways of sort of connecting African-American leaders throughout the North.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate that. And this seems to be addressed to all of the panelists. How did African Americans maintain their connection to their homeland and spiritual traditions when they were forced to live in the Americas?
Yeah, here I would point to the work of Albert Raboteau, who's recently deceased, his pioneering book Slave Religion, where he notes that, you know, for many slaves, they were forced to attend religious services that, you know, that saw a minister just telling them not to steal, not to lie, all of that. That really wasn't introducing them to, you know, real Christianity, wasn't concerned about their salvation, or even really developing their moral character outside of its relation to the burgeoning capitalist economy. So slaves would take their sort of spiritual lives into their own hands, and late at night and during free times or whenever they could slip away, they would go down to the rivers and the arbors and whatnot, and would practice their faith traditions, you know, out of sight of the masters. So this was largely a Southern phenomenon, but we see this in New England as well, right? William Pearson, in his book Black Yankees, notes the persistence of African religious traditions, even in a situation where you had demographically very small numbers of Africans and African descended people in Massachusetts, Connecticut, whatnot. So, you know, even for the people that I look at, right, some of them were theologically interested in universalism and in the sort of forerunners to Unitarianism, which we refer to as Arminianism. This was Charles Chauncey during the 1740s and 1750s, preached sort of a kind of a proto-Unitarianism, that denomination wouldn't emerge till later. But even those enslaved people who were participating in those churches and who liked the theology, or maybe liked some of the practical benefits that they gained from going to these churches, they still practiced their own traditions on their own, right? Whenever they could get together with other enslaved people. So really it was just finding spaces outside of the gaze of their masters, whether it's late at night or some other times where they could kind of keep their traditions alive, and even create new ones, because we know that that these enslaved people are coming from all different places, right, in West Africa. And so it's not always just about preserving their traditions, but about sort of negotiating and creating new ones with with people who might have kind of similar beliefs, but, a little bit different practices. So yeah, those are some of the main ways.
Okay, thank you so very much. I trust now that Chief Wándé is connected with us and is able to answer the question.
Am I connected now?
Yes, you are indeed. So wonderful to hear your voice.
Right. What's the question again?
The question was asking whether you could share some example of the stories that are in the book or in the Yoruba books, and give us some sense of what they were like.
The literature of Ifa, right?
Yes.
The literature deals with the full range of Yoruba experience in the world. We could talk about human beings. We could talk about animals. We could talk about rivers, oceans, lakes. So, say for example, it can talk about ancestors. Ó ní bàbá rọ́ lọ́rọ̀ ẹni sọ̀rọ̀sọ̀rọ̀ làádá. Adúá fún Ọ̀rúnmìlà. Ifá ń lọ lè bégúngún múlẹ̀ lágbàlá. Mo bégúngún múlẹ̀, mo diwin Ọ̀rúnmìlà ẹ̀là sòdè. Ifá ló bégúngún múlẹ̀ lágbàlá. Mo bégúngún múlẹ̀, mo diwin. Ó ní mo bégúngún múlẹ̀, mo diwin ooo. Mo bégúngún múlẹ̀, mo diwin. Ọ̀rúnmìlà ẹ̀là sòdè. Ifá ló bégúngún múlẹ̀ lágbàlá. Mo bégúngún múlẹ̀, mo diwin. He's talking about ancestors, and he says everybody needs to make something like a covenant with his ancestors. And if you do that, and you remember your ancestors, you worship them, you too will live very long, because they are going to bless you all the way.
Thank you so very much for that. I see that Reverend Thompson has rejoined us. Let me ask you one of the questions, one question that asked, where were the Boston activists in the church? Well, this is asking more a question of abolitionism. But can you speak to the role of abolitionists, of activists in the contemporary New England area, in the church, and what is the connection between the church and political participation, etc.?
So you're speaking contemporary.
Yes, contemporarily. Yes.
To us?
To us today, yes.
Okay, good. And so the question is, what is the church doing to continue these issues of liberation and freedom?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So my denomination, which is African Methodist Episcopal, was founded as a step for freedom and in response to racial discrimination. And it was a specific historical incident in Philadelphia that involved Africans who were worshiping at a white church, at a Methodist Episcopal church, and who were discriminated against. And they walked out in a body and began an institution that became the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Both the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, which was founded for similar reasons in New York, and the CME, or the Christian Methodist Episcopal, which is a breakoff of the AME Zions. Those organizations are still vital and viable and function in New England now. And our founding histories remain powerful for us. So that in the AME Church, the notion of working for freedom continues. In all AME churches, we talk about this. The founding of the AME Church, the founder, Richard Allen, was born in February, which happens to be Black History Month. So it really is, there's always this, commonality in celebration and in honoring the ancestors. Really, in all Black Christianity, in my experience, we all understand where we came from and express gratitude to the past. We all know that we are here standing on the faith of our ancestors who went before us. We all know this. This is part of African American spirituality. That is the notion that God sets us free. Now, since the 70s and the 80s, there's been a national conversation that has placed a lot of emphasis on personal sin and responsibility. And that sometimes seems to overrule the social concerns. But that has never been the case in the Black community. We've been able to talk about salvation, individual salvation, and yet still talk about corporate and communal responsibility. So that has never changed. Now, if you're asking specifically, there are organizations that are that include religious leaders like the NAACP, which function, and there are also organizations, and a lot of churches, most churches actually, have some type of activity that will strengthen the work and the lives of young people and students. So tutoring, that type of thing usually happens, and those are always positive and helpful tools of liberation and the acquisition of freedom. You must be, you have to be able to handle the tools of freedom, like reading and writing and all the rest. Did that answer the question? Did it address it?
Yes, yes, I'm sure it does. I am aware that we have really approached the end of our time for this session, unfortunately. I know that there's so many more questions we could pose. I have a whole long list of them myself, but I want to ask everybody to please join me in thanking our panelists and to thank yourselves for participating in this session. I want to remind everyone to continue our conversations and our considerations of remembering and healing and our exploration of the conference theme. The next panel, which begins at 10:45, is entitled A Check Uncashed, Past and Present Projects for Reparations. So please thank our panelists and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for sharing this.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm glad
Thank
you were
you.
waiting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone for waiting and being patient. Forgiving me for being absent so long.
If people are willing to hear a few minutes before Baba goes, Baba, would you tell the story of Ori, how we choose our destiny?
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the stories that I was talking about in the far. Before we were born as human beings into this earth, we existed in a subliminal world as small children. Only a few of those small children will be born into our own earth. All the others will remain in heaven, where we all came from. And when it is time to be born, you will first travel to the home of someone in Yoruba mythology known as Ajala. He is the one who molds heads in heaven. These are not our own physical head, but a spiritual head. And then you go to his home. The home of Ajala is in the same abode, like an apartment, in the home of the high god Olodumare. It's a free choice. You go to where it puts all the heads and you choose your own and put it on your physical head. And then it disintegrates, goes inside you, and that is what determines your destiny. So you travel from the home of Ajala as a child through your mother's womb, and then you are born as a child on this earth. Depending on the kind of head you chose. If you chose a wholesome one, when you get to the earth, it won't take time before if you have any project or you are doing anything, you become successful. If the head you chose was one that was not fired enough by Ajala, or was not fired at all, or through the passage in our mother's womb that all of us have to pass through, it will rain fire, it will rain blood, and then that head that was not well made or well fired becomes injured. So another reason why we have to do sacrifice is to repair a head that has already been injured through that passage. So when you do sacrifice, it begins to mold, repair that head until it becomes wholesome again. So this principle of free will in European philosophy is called free will and determinism. The contribution of the Yorubas to it is this principle of Ori, that you can repair a head that is not wholesome, and it's only when you have restored it that you will become successful once again. And if you got a head that was wholesome from Ajala's home, everything becomes smooth sailing for you when you are here on earth.
Thank you, Baba, for sharing that. So we'll go to break now with the thoughts of thinking about what we have to do in our own spiritual lives in order to become wholesome again. Thank you all. We'll see you back for the next session at 10:45. Thank you, thank you, thank you.